Hey guys, and welcome to another 7-minute lecture. It's been a while, but I did have to assure my viewers with the new year that I was still alive. The subscriber count is also doubled from 200 to 400 in the time that I've been gone, so perhaps silence is the best stimulant of growth, but I'm here to sabotage all that nonetheless with a new video. Our topic today is very relevant to current affairs. A non Western perspective on the Russia Ukraine conflict, as in, where do the major non Western nations stand on this issue? Now, keep in mind that this war itself is obviously a huge topic overall. I will probably upload a separate video on the Russian perspective, another on the Ukrainian perspective, another on from the Western perspective, one more explaining the history of the conflict, etc., etc. Since this is obviously not a war that can be covered in 7 minutes, so there will be other videos naturally. But what I wanted to do here was just share one thing that has stood out to me as a defense analyst from the very beginning of the war, and something that I don't see being discussed much in the Western media. And this basic observation I'm referring to is that Western consolidation of global opinion, even among its own allies, is probably the weakest now than it's ever been since the peak of the Cold War many, many decades ago. Look at what happened when this war first broke out, right? NATO and all of its friends put a tremendous amount of pressure, painting the Ukrainian cause as a global one and heavily pushing the narrative that all responsible nations must support Ukraine and must condemn Russia. And yet, every major geopolitical power outside of the West, China, India, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, essentially all of them have straight up refused to take up a strong stand against Russia. Turkey initially voted in favor of the first resolution condemning Russia, but they've essentially done nothing since then. They've refused to join the sanctions regime, they've refused to close off airspace to Russian aircraft. The Saudis and Brazil also voted in favor of the initial resolution, but have since declined to do anything about it. In fact, Brazil abstained from the most recent UN resolution. India and China have been abstaining, as you all probably know, from the very beginning. So, all of that international pressure has essentially amounted to nothing for both the Zelensky and the Biden administrations, respectively. And this is despite none of these non Western countries being as dependent on Russia as Europe is. So it's not like they did it because they were scared of losing Russia as a partner. They simply did not find it to be in their own interest to side against the Russians simply because NATO tells them to. And to be honest, many of these countries do not find Ukraine's cause to be that sympathetic anyway, since most of these countries themselves have been watching the expansion of NATO over the last 20 years with concern, and they don't really buy into the argument that poor old NATO is only doing this to control the evil Russians. While it's very true that Russian aggression is a factor, the reality is that Russia and NATO are both expansionist powers who keep expanding by using the other side's encroachment as a justification for their own expansion. And this has now become quite transparent to many of these non aligned, non Western countries. Even worse for the West is that, forget about the non aligned ones, countries like India, Brazil, particularly Saudi Arabia, these are all supposed to be close allies as of 2022 and 2023. Saudi Arabia, in particular, has probably been the closest and most unshakable US ally since the 1970s. And even they have refused to take up a stand against the Russians. And all American attempts to sort of intimidate the Saudis into submission have also backfired because, as we saw from Xi Jinping's visit to Saudi Arabia last month, Mohammed bin Salman is now taking his country much closer to Beijing than it's ever been before. And a big part of that is the general unhappiness in that region with the American and European response to how they want the Saudis to react to this war. I find all of this particularly interesting because during the height of COVID, there was a lot of speculation about what post-pandemic geopolitics would look like. Would it be unilateral, as in one country like the US calling all the shots? Would it be bilateral, where the Americans and the Chinese are the two dominant forces, which is where the world seemed to be heading before the pandemic? Or was it going to be multilateral, with a lot of different nations standing their ground and implementing their own foreign policy decisions that were independent of what the great powers wanted from them? And this crisis, which is the first real global crisis after COVID, seems to have given us the answer that the world is now far more multilateral than it's been in a long time. In fact, you could argue that we haven't really seen a situation like this in over a century, where so many non-Western nations took whatever stand they wanted, and it was the West that now had to send in delegations and negotiators and bribes to beg these countries essentially to side with them, something which Western diplomacy simply took for granted since the Cold War especially ended. Will this shape an entirely new era in geopolitics though? Or will this simply be a minor blip in a much larger pattern? As always, only time will tell. If you like content like this, please don't forget to share and subscribe. Take care, and I'll see you guys soon.